Good afternoon to those joining us here at the Atlantic Council in person and virtually on our live stream. Welcome to today's event on climate change as a threat multiplier and implications for U.S. defense and global security. We are in for an important strategic conversation and also just really a treat. So welcome. I'm Jenna Ben-Yehuda, the Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm really so delighted to introduce this discussion with Sherry Goodman, Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security and Board Director at the Atlantic Council, who is here to discuss her new book, Threat Multiplier, Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. As many of you know, Sherry is really a trailblazer in both the climate and national security fields, having served as the Pentagon's first Chief Environmental Officer and having coined the now widely adopted term threat multiplier, which really aptly captures the way climate change exacerbates existing security risks. In her new book, which the Washington Post called A Reminder That Progress Can Be Made However Slowly It May Go, Sherry goes inside the Pentagon and onto the battlefield to show us how the U.S. military is confronting climate change as a pressing national security and defense challenge. I'm also delighted to welcome Ali Rogan, correspondent for PBS NewsHour and PBS News Weekend, who will be moderating today's discussion. Sherry's book, Threat Multiplier, comes at a pivotal moment. The U.S. military, which once really lagged behind on environmental issues, has now transformed into a leader in climate resilience. In her book, Sherry shows us how climate change has been integrated into the military's strategic planning, from war games to disaster preparedness and base design. This evolution is not just a change in tactics, but a necessary adaptation to new global realities. The military is now deeply engaged in addressing how climate stressors, such as extreme weather events and resource scarcity, threaten both national security and operational readiness. And this mirrors the work that we're doing here at the Atlantic Council, where we aim not only to address and raise awareness of these security challenges, but to build bridges across sectors and regions to address them head-on. In fact, the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and the Scowcroft Center Strategy and Security Center, which are co-hosting today's events, have both been deeply engaged at the intersection of energy, climate, and security. The Global Energy Center is actively growing a body of work on energy and defense as an offshoot of its Veterans Advanced Energy Fellowship. And the Scowcroft Center, likewise, recently launched the Adrienne Arsht National Security Resilience Initiative. And it's wonderful to have the vice chair of our board, Adrienne Arsht, here with us today. In both of these efforts, the Atlantic Council aims to drive new thinking on how to ensure that our military and global defense systems remain resilient in the face of growing climate threats. The topic of today's discussion, how climate acts as a threat multiplier, has real-world implications. We're seeing adversaries like Russia and China exploiting vulnerabilities created by climate stressors, especially in regions like the Arctic, where melting ice has transformed the strategic calculus, leading to increased militarization and competition. Meanwhile, climate-driven migration and resource scarcity fuel instability in regions already prone to conflict, such as the Sahel and parts of South Asia. As someone who's spent a lot of time working on many of these issues, I've seen how quickly these dynamics can escalate. We know that climate change accelerates competition for resources like water and energy, undermines fragile governments, and creates environments ripe for conflict. And the truth is, this is no longer an issue for the future, it's happening now. So Sherry's book has some solutions for us and tells the story of how our military leaders, once definitely skeptical, have since embraced climate adaptation, not only as a necessity for resilience, but as a matter of mission assurance. If military bases are vulnerable to sea level rise or extreme weather, our national security is at risk. This shift in mindset from one of environmental neglect to one of environmental leadership is something that Sherry has championed for over 3 decades, starting with her role as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. Her story is not only one of personal dedication, but one that parallels the U.S. military's own evolution in this space. And we here at the Atlantic Council are also grateful for Sherry's longtime leadership on the board of directors, 22 years and counting. Today's conversation really isn't just about identifying the problems, it's also about exploring the solutions. How have military leaders revised national defense strategies to address climate change as a threat multiplier? How can contingency plans be optimized to enhance operational readiness and resilience against climate impacts? How are adversaries like China and Russia leveraging climate change to further their geostrategic agendas? These are questions that both the Atlantic Council and Sherry's work seek to answer, and I, for one, am very eager to hear her thoughts. So, without further ado, over to you, Allie.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's my honor to moderate this conversation with Sherry, who is not someone that I simply deeply respect and admire, but she also happens to be a neighbor, and we share a love of our local coffee spot. In Threat Multiplier, Sherry seamlessly weaves together the military's evolution on climate change and her own experience as a top DoD official, because in large part, they are one and the same. Today, the U.S. military views the fight against climate change and the need for environmental stewardship not as hindrances to the mission, but as critical components of it. And Sherry was not only a witness to that shift, she was one of its key drivers. That's where I'd like to pick up the conversation. Of course, as we mentioned, the book is called Threat Multiplier, a term you aptly coined. Why is climate change a threat multiplier?
Well, thank you very much, Allie. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And if you would allow me, I first want to thank Jenna for that very generous introduction. My mother and husband, who are probably watching now, would very much like that. And you got the brief, so thank you. And thank you to Adrian Arsht, who has been, had the privilege of serving on the board with you now for many years, and your leadership and support of the council and of me personally and many others knows no bounds except for more ice cream. And I also want to thank Landon and the Global Energy Center team, and Chase and Matt Kronig and the Scowcroft team. It's really great, and other board members who are here, and other friends and colleagues, and Fred, who couldn't be with us today, but Fred's leadership at the council, which I've been with since his whole tenure, has really been fabulous and made this place just one of the most fabulous leading organizations in Washington today. So thank you to all of you. So, Allie, and thank you for taking the time here with us today. So climate change as a threat multiplier, a term I coined in 2007 when I organized the first group of U.S. generals and admirals to address the national security implications of climate change. At the time, we said it would lead to instability in volatile regions of the world and threaten us here at our homeland. And it has become ever more true with each passing year that a changing and destabilized natural systems also affects the stability we so seek in our security. Because not only do we have disrupted political systems and governance, we now have an Earth system which is not reliable based on the historical past. Each year is hotter than the next. Wildfires all year round, sea level rise swallowing up whole small island nations, flooding, extreme weather events, permafrost thaw and collapse in the Arctic. And all of this disruption in our natural systems also has geostrategic implications affecting us all around the globe and here at home.
You write that not so long ago, protecting the planet had yet to become the partisan plank that it is today. It seems that the military has, to some extent, been able to insulate itself from some of that politicization. But do you think that the political nature of the issue of climate change has affected the mission, and if so, how?
Well, climate change has certainly become an issue for the mission because it affects, for example, how our troops can do amphibious landings and where they have to deploy and what type of energy they use. So it affects every aspect of military training and readiness. Now, I'd say it's been less political in the military and in the Department of Defense than elsewhere, in part because when bases are affected, when sea levels are rising, or drought is affecting training and maneuver areas, and some of our military in the room today know this full well, that of course the members of Congress in whose district these bases are want to keep that mission there regardless. And so there's been wide bipartisan support for ensuring that our bases are resilient and can adapt to the effects of climate change. And I'd say the same is true for our troops. Increasingly, because of heat, we have more black flag days where the wet bulb temperature, the heat and humidity are over 95 degrees, and troops can't train to the same extent because of health risks, or in the future they may not be able to deploy in certain regions of the world without certain either protective gear or other adaptations. And so there's support for protecting our troops as well.
You wrote today in Scientific American about what the nature of warfare might look like in 2050, when our bases might be more imperiled by flooding and things of that nature, and we might be dealing with missions as varied as still defending Taiwan from Chinese aggression. So to the point that Jenna was making in her introduction, how do you anticipate our rivals, including China and Russia, are going to take advantage of the climate crisis as a military issue?
Well, yes, great question. And I think China, for example, which thinks strategically about all of this, is well aware both of its own climate vulnerabilities. It faces sea level rise risks in the Pearl River Delta, which is its main manufacturing area, drought in the Northwest, more extreme weather events. But they also understand that more extreme storms, combined perhaps with the cyber threat, which is a future scenario I laid out in this piece today, could give it an opening to take advantage of a vulnerability in our deployments in that region if we're not accounting for all those potential future contexts. So a cyber outage combined with an extreme weather event, would that create a wedge for China to take an aggressive action? And our military is looking at all of this now in the war games that it is undertaking and the scenarios it's looking at in every region of the world. So these are, and China at the same time sees the opportunities of the vulnerabilities that others in the Indo-Pacific region face, particularly small island nations like Kiribati and Tuvalu, which may have to relocate parts of their population to other nations and are already planning for that as their atolls and outlying areas are overtaken by sea level rise and loss of fresh water. So, for example, Tuvalu is looking to relocate potentially parts of its population to Australia and Kiribati to Fiji. And so there are a whole host of questions that arise. And in the interim, there are needs about what kind of infrastructure might help them. And China's often ready with an offer of a port or some roads, which may not provide long-term sustainability, but may be very attractive in the near to medium term. Russia, on the other hand, has a whole different view under Putin. Now, Russia in the Arctic is trying to monetize the northern sea route that runs along the vast Russian Arctic coastline into a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. And China, meanwhile, sees itself as a near-Arctic stakeholder or a near-Arctic power and envisions in the future that there will be shorter shipping routes when it can use an Arctic region. So we have a whole new ocean that's opened in our lifetime, and Russia under Putin seeks to take advantage of it. It's still facing permafrost thaw and collapse, which is going to affect the infrastructure that it's building in the region, already has. And if you know anything about Russia's nuclear safety record, and I spent a lot of time in Russia in the 90s when we were denuclearizing Russia, that's something that can keep you up at night. From the Chernobyl to the Kursk submarine, where the Russians lost all of their sailors on board that nuclear submarine, something that's never happened in the U.S. We've never lost a sailor. It's not to be taken lightly that Russia is highly nuclearizing this part of the world.
And so how are we to deal with these threats? And I'm thinking particularly about what you mentioned in terms of China, that they are always ready with the offer of a loan to build a port or something of that nature. These are unique threats that we know the military is thinking about every day. How do you envision it, and what does that debate look like in the corridors of the Pentagon today?
Well, it looks like embedding climate literacy into what the military is doing through a combination of wargaming and understanding how the climate threat could occur by being prepared to operate in the Arctic, sort of upping our game, let's say, for example, to have more capable ice-hardened ships, be able to have equipment that operates in the cold regions. Sometime after the Cold War, we sort of let lapse some of our Arctic capabilities. Now we're having to reinstate many of those. There's a whole transformation occurring in our energy systems because we will be operating in what the Defense Department calls a contested logistics environment, where we will have to provide energy in our forces, our ammunition, our fuel and water in areas that may not be, as we say, permissive, may be contested. So how can you do that in a way that lightens the load, both for the soldier and Marine, but also the types of energy you provide? Can it be better batteries, more renewables, small modular microreactors in some cases, hydrogen fuels, a whole new inventory of possibilities and improved efficiency so that you can have a competitive edge in the battlefield.
And you write a lot in the book about how fuel is such a major part of each mission, each plane that we have fighters on, particularly Iraq, Afghanistan. You talk about all of the many truckloads, the percentage of them that are only geared towards bringing fuel to the battle space. The DoD, as you note, is the nation's single largest energy user, accounting for 1% of all U.S. energy consumption and 76% of the government's fuel consumption. Is the military moving fast enough to, as you quote General Mattis is saying in the book, unleash itself from the tether of fuel? And what more does it need to do?
Well, let's say, Allie, we all need to do more.
Yeah.
I think climate is accelerating faster than our ability to adapt to it at this point. And that's true throughout society. That's true in the U.S. It's true really around the world now, that the effects we are seeing. So we all need to step up our game. I think the military is doing a good job. We could always go faster, right? But I think the military, with its ambitious goals now to achieve net zero in its energy use by 2050 and deploying microgrids on many military bases to achieve that, and investing in those technologies needed to have those better batteries, is really beginning to sort of turn that aircraft carrier that we say sometimes moves slowly, but turn it in some new ways. We should also be mindful that this transformation, this energy transformation, is really linked to what's happening in the commercial sector. It's not going to happen just through defense technology alone. You know, for those of us who came of age in the Cold War, an era where technology was really spun out of a lot of defense research and development, the GPS, internet, you know, that was sort of the high mark of investment in defense R&D that had a spin out effect. And today, really, we're spinning in technology from the commercial sector. So most of these energy technologies will be developed in the commercial sector. They'll be adapted for some specific military uses and needs. But that, you know, and the hard lessons the military learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I give a shout out to my friend and colleague Greg Duquet, who is in the book, Marine retired, who had that direct experience of being, you know, having to move fuel to the front, and many of his and others' forces put their lives on the line, trucking fuel to the front. That awareness 10 plus years ago now, that we needed to adapt, both to save the lives of our soldiers from improvised explosive device IED attacks, but then also lighten our fuel burden, has really laid the groundwork for, I think, being able to seize on that today and look at some new technology
Yeah.
innovations.
And these are clearly things that the military is always thinking about and working to implement. However, events, my dear boy, events. It does seem that, and as you write in the book, there are times when some of these innovations do get overtaken by events, including an effort to modernize naval cruisers right before the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, which of course refocused attention elsewhere, rightfully so. But I wonder, is there a place for climate adaptation to be more seamlessly integrated into national security emergencies? Do you think there needs to be better integration there? Or is that just the nature of warfare, that sometimes some things have to fall by the wayside in order to prioritize others?
No, I think it is happening in real time now, from the rapid equipping forces we had during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars to the Defense Innovation Unit today, which has a whole division devoted to advanced energy technologies. I think they are actually moving quite rapidly to take advantage of a variety of different authorities to enable this transformation to occur. And it's energy technology, but it's also climate predictive technology. The other things that we need to do is to close the gap between reliable weather that we have out for 1 week and sort of the near-term climate prediction. Not the global climate models that tell us what the world might look like 50 to 100 years from now. That's important, but that doesn't help the military operator who's got to plan the operation that's going to happen a few months from now, or conduct a war game, or deploy to a theater. That's sometimes we say a 1 to 10 year time frame. And having a regional climate prediction, local scale climate prediction for the defense decision maker is also an important area of innovation right now. I call it precision climate prediction, or some people call it climate intelligence. It's happening in every sector of the economy right now, where from transportation to insurance to the financial sector, people need more downscaled climate tools for decision making. And it's happening in defense today, and there's a major effort to improve climate prediction.
I'd like to turn to the home front. You write tremendously about climate readiness on the home front. You note that Deputy Secretary Kathleen Hicks reports that the number of personnel days the National Guard spent on firefighting increased from 14,000 days in fiscal year 2016 to 176,000 days in fiscal 2021. And you asked the question, will our military personnel and equipment have the bandwidth to prepare for other critical missions if they have to spend so much time responding to natural disasters? How would you answer that question right now?
Well, I think increasingly our military, active duty, and National Guard are the backup to our first responders who are on the front line for fire, floods, and extreme weather events. And there's an expression, you either pay now or pay more later. So, we're paying for it, the damages that occur from the fires, the floods, the extreme weather events, often after the fact. We need to invest now to help reduce some of those threats. I think that for the foreseeable future, it seems likely that our military is going to have to serve that additional duty in responding to those fires. We've just seen it over at least 5 years now. The National Guard has reported that their person days have been about 10 times what they were before that. And there doesn't seem to be any likelihood that that's going to change.
Do you anticipate that being also the case in overseas conflicts that we deploy troops to and have missions in, that more of the mission is going to have to be devoted to climate, maybe not cleanup, but mitigation, adaptation, emergency, disaster relief? And how does that affect the ability to achieve other elements of the mission?
Well, there is a tracker at the Center for Climate and Security on military response to climate events, and we collect data from militaries around the world on their response to climate events, and we see that number continues to go up each year for all types of events. So it's an interesting this is an interesting challenge because it's a little bit like what we used to call years ago low-intensity conflict that was sort of an other duty as assigned. Our troops are prepared for it. They have the equipment. They can provide that additional support. Then the question is, how does it continue to get funded? During Iraq and Afghanistan wars, it was sort of paid for as an additional cost. Now that cost gets baked in each year, but that's part of defending America. So we expect our forces to be there to help us when we're in the time of need. And I think that's going to continue at some level of investment.
And keeping the focus abroad, you write, especially in your chapter about the Middle East, about the link between climate change and political instability and how that leads to conflict. Syria is a potent case study where in 2010, before the Arab Spring, rural workers were migrating to Syrian cities because of record droughts, and that helped foment the Arab Spring-related uprisings there, which of course led to the Civil War, which led to a security vacuum that ISIS took advantage of. And we continue to see similar crises play out like that all over the world. Is there more that the military is going to be called on to do in terms of addressing the root causes of these conflicts as they increasingly have more to do with climate change as a root cause?
Well, we should be very clear that the military is not the solution to the global climate challenge we face. And that really has to be what we might call either a whole of government solution or one that involves diplomacy, development, humanitarian assistance, many financial, the financial component, many other elements of it. The military can support all of this and should and does and is increasingly involved, particularly because it's good at convening, it's good at bringing the whole of government together, and it's good at working as a partner. So that's partly what we see happening today. I think it's very constructive, but I think we also need our diplomatic, our development, and our international institutions to step up and play the right role as well.
Absolutely. I'd like to digress to something that you mentioned in passing, which is all of the incredible innovations that are taking place at military installations around the country. Paris Island among them in South Carolina, the Marine Recruitment Depot, developing a microgrid to help it remain mission ready in case there are events of extreme weather. So I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about the innovations that you've seen and how they're going to be able to support the readiness of the military in these increasing extreme weather events.
Yeah, thank you. Well, one of the most important objectives now the military has in the U.S. is to be able to have secure energy at all its bases. And to do that, that's sort of climate readiness, we say, is mission readiness. And because we have now a fragile electric grid, there is a goal to have microgrids at all our major military bases, and if possible to have them be net zero. Some bases have already achieved net zero, such as Marine Corps Base Albany in Georgia. And the microgrid will allow the base to island itself and operate even if the grid goes down, and potentially provide power into the local community and support it in a storm or a deliberate attack. So this has been an important innovation, and in the future I think we'll have cities and whole communities that have microgrids that provide for secure power, where you could put more distributed energy resources, localized various types of energy resources, renewables, and others, potentially small micro reactors. And so I think this is also going to help secure our remote bases, particularly in places like Alaska, and be used potentially overseas and with our allies and partners.
It also seems like a great blueprint for the private sector. Is the private sector doing enough to make sure it's keeping up with the military's innovations on this front?
Oh, that's a good question. In some areas, yes, and in some areas, I really do think the military is leading by example, and here in microgrids, I think that's one of them.
You observe that combatant commands overseeing parts of the world with more overt conflict tend to get more resources and support than others that are not involved in overt hot wars at the moment. Does that need to change as the environment becomes more of a factor as to why conflicts start in the first place? And I'm thinking about the Western Hemisphere and the Global South.
It's such a great question, Allie, and very important. And I do tell the story of General Laura Richardson, who is now our Southcom commander, and who, as her predecessors, and in her own very talented way, is very adept at gathering the resources out of the state partnership programs and other resources, because she doesn't, like some commands, have as much force assigned at her headquarters and to her use, and she's having to deal with a variety of hybrid and gray zone threats, Chinese incursions, narco trafficking, disrupted economies, weak and failed governance across parts of Latin America. I mean, many vibrant economies as well. It's a region that is sort of rich in resources and great in talent, and but also very subject to a variety of climate risks, from drought to extreme weather events and flooding. And so she's trying to develop these integrated solutions, drawing heavily on, for example, the state partnership program or resources, because she doesn't have them assigned. It's probably not going to change that much in the near future in terms of that force mix and balance. But I think in terms of integrating the kind of capabilities and having the forces that she draws on, whether it's the state partners or the Coast Guard or her active duty forces, be more climate literate and understand that, I think that's all happening today.
Throughout the book, you document your interactions with members of Congress who are on the relevant overseeing committees, some of whom don't view climate change with the same urgency that you and your colleagues did. And I'm just wondering, what is your hope for the future of the legislative branch, for your partners in policymaking, and how they should view this threat multiplier, what you would like to see differently?
Well, in a perfect world, I'd love to go back to the days of bipartisanship in foreign policy and national security. When I started on the Senate Armed Services Committee, I worked for Senator Nunn. He was the chairman, and our ranking member at the time was John Warner. And the two of them worked hand in glove on every issue. And Senator Warner, when he retired, became a major champion on climate change and worked very closely with me at the Center for Naval Analysis and our Military Advisory Board. Unfortunately, I don't think those days are coming back anytime soon. But I do think that, from the Conservative Climate Caucus that you have in Congress today, there is more opportunity to find, there's more agreement today on climate as a threat multiplier. Sometimes there's not always agreement on the solution set, but there are important areas of growing bipartisanship in some energy solutions. And I think of nuclear, for example, as one of them. There is a lot of bipartisan support for advances in nuclear energy. And I think that we will see, as the need continues to grow, opportunities to have discrete bipartisanship on different climate and particularly energy solutions.
Fascinating. I have one last question, and then I will be turning to questions from the audience here in the room and online. You can submit questions at askac.org. So please do that if you haven't. We already have some great questions coming in. But my last question, a bit of personal privilege here. Throughout this book, you really do inflect personal anecdotes of what it was like working so much of your career in the DoD, being a young woman in a male-dominated field, being a mother on top of that. What would be your advice to young women looking to follow in your footsteps?
Well, thank you, Allie. And I'm pleased to say that no longer is it the case that, most of the rooms at the Pentagon are mostly men, and the world has really changed, and I'm really pleased by that. I think that people have to stand up for themselves and sort of make their voice heard, and you have the opportunity to work with lots of good people, if you have the opportunity to work with lots of good people, men or women, that you can have that opportunity to lead. And also, I think there's much more attention to the need to have a good working balance today. When I was in the Pentagon in the 90s, having young kids, there was no parental leave. There were a lot of things that have changed now. Although my son, one of my boys is here, Robbie, and he survived and thriving now. So it is possible. He was a baby when I was at the Pentagon, and I think there's a lot of support today, and there's a lot more flexibility in the workplace. So I think that's important, and also I think when you want to have a career and a family, as you are doing, and I've done it, a lot of people in the room, it's sometimes said, you can have it all, but not necessarily all at the same time. So if you keep that in mind, I think it is possible to have a very rewarding, both professional and personal life.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience. I believe there are some microphones that are going to be passed around. When you do get the mic, if you could just say your name and your affiliation, then state your question, please, no speeches. Ma'am, right there in the second row.
Sherry, thank you for a wonderful and comprehensive presentation of your book, which we will all buy. You mentioned in your talk this afternoon about the local weather predictor and the importance of that. And zing went in my head when I saw that pier off the coast of Gaza in July, and the weather causing such damage that it only worked for 27 days. Where's your predictor?
Well, first of all, thank you, Diana, and everyone should know Diana Negroponte, who has written a brilliant book about End of the Cold War, yes, and Jim Baker. And so thank you very much for your scholarship and your leadership. Well, I don't think that predictive capability was used before that Gaza pier was deployed. And sometimes, we want so much to provide relief and provide support. And I think these capabilities are, as I said, this is sort of the cusp. This is the frontier of new technologies that will be better available. And yes, in the future, we might have better understood that was not going to be a successful undertaking in that location at that time.
I'd like to turn to a question from our viewers online. This is from Christian Cabanis. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. And this, I know you have many anecdotes about this issue in your book, and so I'm looking forward to asking it. How much of the climate adaptation is just continuing policy discussion, and how much has been translated into actual budgets? And I say that because there's a fabulous anecdote from earlier in your career when you are presenting this very elaborate, ambitious set of goals, and then the person in charge of the budget, in actuality says, well, that's not in my budget. And then it all went away. So we know that so much of this is tied up in the numbers. So how do you see that playing out? Are we seeing the translation from policy to budget that needs to happen?
Yes, thank you, Ali. I do tell the story in the book about my first budget failure, where I didn't understand how requirements are generated and what parts of different 8 services budgets they needed to be in order to be successfully approved each step of the way. And I got shot down at my first big budget meeting. But I learned my lesson from that. And then I learned to understand where the requirements had to be established and whose budget they had to be in, and then to be able to track it. So I think that's what's happened since the Department of Defense developed its climate strategy, and each of the services have its climate strategy out for now at least 2 years now. That then leads to requirements being generated against which budgets and programs and plans can be allowed. And so now there is a lot of funding occurring, investment occurring through all the different relevant accounts, whether it's military construction accounts or operations and maintenance, or research and development, or procurement, using a variety of authorities in order to do the kinds of investment and that lead to the contracting for everything from the microgrids to better batteries to new equipment for our troops.
There is a microphone at the left side of the room. So if you do have a question in the room, could you make your way to the microphone just so we can make sure the cameras pick it up? Sir, why don't you go ahead, and then the next gentleman behind you.
Thank you. Marco Margheri with ENI and the Atlantic Council. Thank you, Sherry. A great presentation and a great book. A question from the Mediterranean, actually. NATO is looking into the Mediterranean. NATO is starting to look into energy and climate. Will these climate developments be a factor of convergence or divergence amongst allies and within NATO? How do you see that role playing out?
Marco, thank you, and thank you for your continued leadership and support at the Atlantic Council. It's always great to work with you. And thank you for that question. NATO, under Secretary General Stoltenberg, has really stepped up its game on climate and energy security and has released several, since 2020 or 21, very important strategies and assessments on climate and energy. And I had the privilege this summer at the NATO summit of leading the event, moderating the event where Prime Minister Trudeau launched the new NATO Center on Climate and Security, which is based now in Montreal. So NATO has a very important role now with our allies and partners, both to understand climate, the risks and threats that we face from climate, but also working with 30 member militaries to serve as an incubator for that energy transition. And the way it does, though, because we have a concept of interoperability of NATO forces, and we have NATO standards. Those are all really important. It sounds kind of bureaucratic and boring, but when you get down to it, what's enduring are your standards of operating together as 30 member nations. And that's the hard work that's occurring within NATO today. Within NATO headquarters, at this new Center for Climate and Excellence, at the Energy Center, there are multiple centers of excellence. And I think this is going to be some of the most enduring and important work that NATO does.
Please.
Thanks. Varun Sivaram, I have the privilege of serving on the Atlantic Council board with Sherry. Sherry, thank you for this great book and being an inspiring leader in climate. You talked a lot about how the military here and abroad, militaries will learn to adapt to the threat multiplier effect of climate change. But it's not fundamentally their responsibility or their ability to solve the root cause of climate change. That is to the diplomats and the other forces that you mentioned. But look forward a couple decades to the point where the threat multiplier effect becomes truly intolerable. And I wonder if you believe there is, in fact, a future where militaries here or abroad do take it into their own hands to try and address that root cause, whether it's through solar geoengineering, through trying to absorb carbon into the ocean, or through other kinds of hard power coercive measures that force other countries to stop emitting greenhouse gases. What could a militarized reaction to climate change mitigation actually look like?
Okay, Varun, well, first, thank you for your leadership and talent. Varun's written a terrific book called Taming the Sun and is a great talent, and so great to have you here on the board at the Atlantic Council. I hope we don't get to that point, Varun. I don't think we should have militarized responses to the climate challenge. I do think that militaries have, as we see already today, they have the capability to support and rescue people from a variety of climate-related impacts, floods, hurricanes, wildfires. And I think that need will continue. When we talk about a future where, and they have a lot of other capabilities as well. So if you talked about solar geoengineering and its deployment, could there be a fleet of aircraft that would be capable of conducting that? Potentially, but I don't think that will be a military activity. I think that would be a civilian activity and probably should be. So I do think that in understanding the impacts in regions around the world, for example, we already see in the last few years the growing focus on food insecurity. You can't have security in a region, as we've learned, is not just the absence of arms, but to be able to have security, you need adequate food and water. And often our military is involved in providing that. And I think that's going to continue. And that sort of brings together, and probably should, with being led by the diplomatic and development community, understanding what those needs are. So we think of food in a security sense, how to have local food security. And I think that work is going to continue. I mean, we have had for years already many expert biologists and agricultural experts and forestry experts throughout the Department of Defense, because those skills have been needed first at home to manage lands that we've had at home, but then those are part of also the civil affairs kind of contingents that we have when we deploy in small units around the world. And I think that could and should continue, but it always should be in support of a broader diplomatic effort.
This next question is online from Anonymous. I love your books. You spoke extensively about microgrids at defense installations. Which technologies are best to power our national security facilities, given China's commanding lead of several clean energy technologies? Which I think is so interesting, because China does have tremendous market share in so many of the technologies that we require, and of course there are already severe limitations on what the military can use. But how do we negotiate that between China's leadership on these technologies and our need to be energy independent?
Well, we need to, in certain cases, we need to make more at home. And the military has to, in most cases, buy, as much as it can from U.S. sources. But, we need to be mindful that, it is still a global economy. And we need to reinforce that by ensuring that we have enough security in our own supply, which has been challenging, particularly for some of the critical minerals that we need for the energy transition. And as you say, China certainly has big lead in the solar market. So we need to be stepping up our own game. And sometimes, in certain discrete cases, the demand signal that a military buyer can send, because of its buying power, because, as we noted, it is a larger energy user, can help make that shift.
The gentleman in the room, please.
Hi, how are you? My name is Jordan Rivers. I am not with the Atlantic Council. I am a student at Sacramento State here in DC for an internship program. I had sent a question electronically. Please disregard it. Now, we talk about our adversaries, how they take advantage of the climate crisis. We talk about them a lot. However, I think for our allies in the states that act ideally in our best interest, that enough has also not been done. In regards to Israel, new oil deposits were discovered off its Mediterranean coastline. My question is, given the situation Israel is facing in defense, to say the least, also in high readiness, to say the least, now given the fact that warfare is waged conventionally, does conflict halt sustainable plans to integrate renewable means? And does it only serve as a purpose and as a contributor to maintain conventional energy, and how that and the consequences of that? Thank you.
You have a great anecdote in the book about the water partnership that was taking place prior to October 7th, and what a missed opportunity that is. I wonder if this is an opportune time to talk
Yes,
about
I do tell the story of EcoPeace Middle East, which is Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli co-directors who for 20 plus years have been developing water and energy partnerships, and particularly a plan for an water energy exchange between Jordan providing solar energy and Israel providing water, both needing the energy and water from the other. And of course, some of that has been halted by the conflict. So yes, there could be, and there could be much broader, as you imply. The Indo-Middle East energy corridor could have much broader interconnections if we didn't have conflict in the region, and there are those resources in the Med. And so that's among the many reasons we should be moving towards more peace and better integration in the region. Thank you.
Another question online, a very interesting one from Megan Parker. How does the U.S. military's approach to climate change compare to that of the militaries of its allies or other global powers? Are we keeping pace?
Well, I'd say a number of our NATO allies are addressing addressing the climate challenge and energy transition with as much focus as we are, particularly our Nordic allies, the UK, a number of our NATO allies, Australia and New Zealand. And there are a growing number of countries who are aware of the climate risks and are also trying to make those investments. And I'd say it's not just in Europe and it's not just those countries. I mean, Kenya, for example, is an important partner to the US on climate, and its military is also very active in understanding how to address its climate and energy challenges.
Sir in the room?
Good afternoon. My name is Tomáš Koren, and I'm here with the Czech Embassy. I would like to ask, you've acknowledged that climate politics have been subject to, well, politicization, and it's become, to a certain extent, a matter of political identity and great polarization. My question is whether this also applies to some of the strategic opponents that the West has, whether it would be China or Russia, and whether this politicization of the question actually impairs our capacity to be opponents, to oppose those countries and to maintain our technological edge.
Well, I would say there's a growing dimension of climate mis and disinformation that we see occurring worldwide, and that is, we have mis and disinformation in a variety of things, from the election booth to cyber threats is a real challenge. But in climate, we also see that happening where information is being manipulated, where you see feeds about when some bad event occurs, a big rainstorm. When the UAE had a few months ago a rainstorm, and there were some news articles about how, well, that was caused by some in the West. Okay, so, which of course was incorrect. But I think that this is going to be a part of the kind of disinformation world in which we live, and we're going to have to, that's why efforts like the Atlantic Council's digital forensics labs are so important to really sort out the truth from the falsehoods.
I'd like to see, if we have about 5 minutes left, if we could ask these two remaining gentlemen in the room to please say your question, and then we'll give Sherry the opportunity to do a bit of a lightning round with your question. So if the two of you could please just state your questions, and then I'll give Sherry an opportunity to answer.
Great. Good evening. My name is Antonio Salinas, and I'm an Army officer, and also I studied climate and conflict and history at Georgetown. My question is, from your talk and your book, it sounds like a lot of work's been done on infrastructure resiliency, which I think is great. But I'm wondering, you also mentioned Black Flag Days and its impact on personnel. If you could talk about resiliency in the warfighter itself, such as training, technology, or medical research.
Great. Resiliency in the warfighter. And sir?
Thanks so much for being here. My name is Jared Mandelbaum, and I was just curious because you discussed a bit about planned or state-driven or state-sponsored climate migration. I was curious what your view is on the U.S.'s preparations for the potential and even current destabilizing effects of unplanned inter- and intra-regional climate migration around the world.
Okay, two great questions. Thank you, the gentleman in the back. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kath Hicks, talks about how we now, in the climate era, we need to own the heat in the way 20 years ago we talked about owning the night with night vision goggles. So this is sort of the new frontier in military health in the climate era, being understand, first and foremost, how you might have to change training regimens like in the very near term, because of the Black Flag Days, maybe you train earlier in the day, or you alter the training times. Then it's about changing the equipment. And then it's also about understanding, and later this week, I'm going to speak at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where they're really focused on understanding disease vectors and how infectious disease is going to affect us generally, but also with a focus on what our military needs to understand as they're more exposed. As to the question on migration, well, I think that's a challenge for all of us as nations, and we see that so much of global migration now is driven by drought and climate-induced effects, particularly in our own hemisphere and in parts of Africa into Europe. And so that's why building that resilience at home, wherever home is, not our own home front, but also what our combatant commanders are doing to try to understand how to build resilience, working with our diplomats and our development professionals and the private sector, very important here, to understand how to build that resilience at the local level, because that's what's going to make enable sustainable futures in all of these areas.
I think we have time for one more online question, which is from Isaac Geisler, who asks, how do you think will the U.S. election change the development of climate change adaptation within the U.S. military? Certainly a topic we're all watching very closely and have lots of questions about, but asking you to read the tea leaves a little bit.
Well, hopefully we'll be accelerating into the future. And I think I'll just leave it at that.
Excellent. Okay. Sherry, do you have, I invite you to make any closing remarks that you wish after this fabulous conversation.
Well, I want to thank you for leading a great discussion, Allie. And I want to also thank my Atlantic Council colleagues and friends for all that you've done. And I do think that this, I've spent my life trying to mainstream environment and then climate into our national security and foreign policy. And there was a time when this kind of discussion would not have occurred in a place like this, or in many other places around town, or certainly in the Pentagon. And now that it does, we're at a new day, and I think that we can confront this with a clear-eyed way and hopefully be leading a better world for Robbie and all the other young people here today. So thank you all.
And that is largely thanks to you. So.
Thank you.
My thanks to Sherry. Thanks for all of you for joining us in the room today and online. This concludes the program. Sherry will be outside in the lobby signing some books. And of course, Threat Multiplier is available wherever books are sold. And so please don't forget to grab your copy and get it signed on the way out. Thank you all so much.